Thank you for welcoming us to the EBRD. Since you became the 6th president of the EBRD in 2012, your inaugural report under your leadership was Stuck in Transition. Quite a controversial, punchy title. Do you still think there are EBRD members who are stuck in transition?
Sure, I think there's a sort of sweep of countries. Some of them, since that report, have re-energized their transition, if you like, and some are still trying to do that. So, if you look back at 2013 when that report came out, what we were saying was there'd been sort of a decade and a half of really strong movement in the right direction towards open market economies. Financial crisis comes along, a lot of people reevaluate whether they can move at the same pace as they did. And there was a lot of pushback, I think, in many electorates against the open market venture, if you like. But since then, it's been quite striking. There have been 3 or 4 countries I'd highlight which have again re-energized themselves. I think Kazakhstan is one, very clearly, in the last 12 months, a major success story, moving again in the direction of open market economics and so on. I think another one I would say is Ukraine. Ukraine, we invested heavily for 24 years and the country systemically didn't really shift. The projects were great successes, but the country was still looking not much different from 1991. And in anything, it really, in per capita income terms, had fallen behind countries like Poland and others. So for us, the last year has been an astonishing sort of reburst of energy in that country of moving towards transition, working with a new government on policies that were previously just rejected out of hand. There's another example, Albania, Serbia, there's some others as well, Jordan, which are again all re-energizing transition in the last few years. Still alongside the sort of stars, if you like Poland has quite clearly been over the last 2 decades, very much so. But these countries are coming back, and that makes me feel rather good about what that report restarted, if you like.
Indeed, Poland really a growth champion, growing at almost 3.5%. Hungary as well, over 4%. If you take Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary together, they really are seriously outperforming Western Europe now. How can these countries maintain that growth advantage, and what can the EBRD do to help them?
Well, I think in the case of certainly Poland and the Czech Republic, good examples of countries that took quite tough measures early on. I think the Baltic states would be another set of countries that took tough measures early on when the financial crisis hit, and therefore managed to ride out the worst of those crises. In the case of Poland particularly, of course, it's a more diversified economy. So when one sector goes down, there are other sectors you can still rely on. It's quite a large economy compared with many of our other economies in the region. So the other thing to bear in mind about particularly Poland and the Czech Republic and the Baltics too, is public administration really matters. I think we at EBRD, because we're a very private sector organisation, rightly so, we need to also understand for the private sector to flourish, you need decent regulatory frameworks. You need governments that are consistent in their policies. And what you've had in Poland and Czech Republic, the Baltics, have been governments who have actually pursued a course of action. Even if the party running the government has changed, they've been on a direction which is going the right direction. And that has lasted over a long time. And that's given investors, private sector investors, foreign investors, the confidence that there's a consistent policy approach and consistent administrative approach that they can actually put their money into.
Now, during your time at the EBRD as president, there have, of course, been economic headwinds from both sides. We've had the Eurozone lurching from crisis to crisis. And, of course, in Russia, we've had not quite the economic implosion of 1998, but certainly, or 2008 even, but certainly a big economic slowdown. Do you think the EBRD has helped growth within your region to be faster than it otherwise would have been? And if so, how has it done that?
I think certainly in those countries where EBRD has managed to help with the policy reforms, the policy changes that have been in the right direction, supported reformers, reforming regions, yes, I would say unequivocally EBRD has been part of that story. Part of the story. You can't attribute the whole of that success, of course, to one institution. But we've worked with people in those countries who've been about change and moving in the right direction. Take Russia would be a good example. Huge economy, of course. Where has EBRD been most successful? I would say in the reforming regions like Kaluga, like Tatarstan, where we've had very reforming administrations who have attracted foreign investors into those administrations. So the whole automotive sector in Kaluga very much to do with trying to attract those foreign investors in, with EBRD supporting with investment, but EBRD also helping the local administration design, the policies that would attract these investors in. That's been a success story, and we need more of that actually in some of the other countries.
I've made several visits to Kaluga over the years. I mean, VW factories,
Yes.
L'Oreal factories, Samsung factories. It really is quite incredible. How has it been over the last 12 months when relations between the West and the East have cooled, to say the least? Has the EBRD managed to maintain its relationships with policymakers and practitioners on the ground in Russia, in the biggest economy in your region?
So you're right. I mean, since the end of July last year, our board gave us this guidance that we shouldn't bring any new projects in Russia to the board. So what we've been doing is managing our portfolio of 300 existing projects. And part of that, managing that portfolio, has been keeping engaged, firstly, with the private sector, those clients who we've worked with, but also it's been about keeping engaged with the reforming politicians and administrators, both at the centre, but also in the regions like Kaluga, like in Kazan as well, in Tatarstan. Very much maintaining that linkage, going to workshops, going to conferences, as much as we can, to maintain the contact for the day when we can actually, again, one day, get back into Russia and start originating projects again. So it's been very important. And anyway, even if we are not actually investing new projects in Russia at the moment, it's important that we give our ideas so the Russians can actually use those ideas if they want to really formulate their own approach going forward.
Of course, it's absolutely incumbent on you to manage your existing portfolio of outlay, shareholders' cash, governments and others, sanctions or no sanctions. But is it true to say you have had cooperation on the Russian side when it comes to maintaining relationships during what's obviously a difficult period when it comes to the high politics?
Yes, we have. I mean, we can measure it in the number of engagements, not just at my level, but all the way down through the organisation. At my level, I mean, since that July guidance last year, I've been twice to Moscow, spent time with ministers there, with my own staff. I've also seen the same Russian ministers outside Russia too. So we try to maintain engagement throughout. And it goes, as I say, for the staff that are based in Russia too. They've also been working with the Russian authorities, Russian private sector, on a variety of things, but not new projects.
The summit's in Georgia, of course, growing quite well, about 4.5%. What more do you think the EBRD can do in Georgia? Obviously, memories of the conflict of 2008 still quite fresh, certainly in investors' minds. How much potential do you see in this economy?
I see enormous potential in the Georgian economy. One of the reasons for having this annual meeting in Georgia is that Georgia is one of the earliest success stories we've had in the last 10 years. It's a really changed course, attracted a lot of foreign investors in. Of course, then it's changed government, and it's now trying to do the same again with a new government there. And it's very important to showcase what has been achieved in Georgia. It's no accident that the Georgian success story is looked at by the Ukrainians, for example, very, very closely. What do the Georgians do? What can we actually copy, emulate in Kiev to try and capture some of that success story? So Georgia is actually a rather good benchmark for the region, for the Caucasus, but more broadly, I think, for EBRD in terms of turning itself around on investment climate, on corruption, on using its natural resources. It doesn't have oil, as one Georgian minister said to me. We don't have oil, we've got water. So using the hydropower as a way of exporting energy to Turkey and others, that's been a great success. And so we've just had a fantastic project there, in fact, bringing together the IFC, the Asian Development Bank, with Tata Power of India, to create this fantastic hydro project, the Shorkevi hydro project, which will, again, export energy out of Georgia.
Paint us a picture. What could the Georgian economy be in 20, 25 years' time?
Well, it would be nice if in 20, 25 years' time we were at the Harvard Business School together and we were reading about the case study that was Georgia. That hasn't happened yet. And that is, I think, the next leap that Georgia needs to make, where it becomes a benchmark for emerging market economies, that everyone regards it as not just a 10-year success story, but the success story that was locked in across different political parties, different administrations, and is then marketed more broadly. I think that could happen. When I talk to investors, not just from Western Europe, but also to investors from India, from the Far East, from Southeast Asia, they all look at Georgia as not a very big country, but one where they think this is going in the right direction, and they want to put their money. Hence Tata, hence other Jindal, in Indian steel producers also there. These are investors who want to be there because Georgia offers a very attractive investment climate.
Just while we're on that kind of east to east link up, I was going to ask you about it earlier, but you are of course Bengali born. You're the first foreign born permanent sec, with all respect, we've had here in the UK, and now you've made this leap to the EBRD. Tell us how you see this sort of south on south investment playing out over the next decade or so as investors from countries like India, from Brazil, begin to invest in the EBRD region. We see lots of signs of this in our BNE subscription base, believe it or not.
Yes.
Huge interest in our publication in places like India. Could this become a sort of big economic trend? It's not this flow of cash and sharing of expertise and interest and increasing diplomatic cooperation isn't yet something that mainstream Western business commentators have caught up with, it seems to me.
No, I think you're right. I think the data shows there's a lot more of this going on than actually the commentators perhaps realise. And we talked about Georgia, but to give you another example, the whole Balkans area, from Slovenia right the way down to Greece, a lot of those countries are trying to attract not just capital from Western Europe and North America, which they should as well, but to widen their portfolio. They're looking at the Gulf, they're looking at the Far East, India, China, and so on. And they're being relatively successful. It's very interesting what they're doing. I was at the BLED Economic Conference, second time there, I was there in late August, early September. And this was one focused very much on Chinese and Indian investors, how to get them into the country. I've been very struck when I took the Serbian authorities about how much they're doing to try and get Gulf investment into Serbia. Etihad is now, of course, involved with their airline. And that is all part of a story of change that's going on. And I think for EBRD, what's important is we engage with this change, and we also try and attract investors from all over the world to join with EBRD in implementing projects, of course, but also just to get them more interested in our region. Our region, is starved of long-term capital. It's quite striking compared with other emerging markets. If you go to South Asia, if you go to Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa now, there's a lot of long-term capital going in. We've got to tell the story better as EBRD as to why our region also needs long-term capital, and sovereign wealth funds as well as private investors should come in to our region, and that's part of what I see as my job as well.
Hasn't there been an assumption among Western policymakers until quite recently, even until now, that capital only originates in the West and it has to come from the West, or there won't be the money? Don't the investment flows from places like India and China really upend those assumptions, and won't that have big implications on the shape of the multilaterals going forward?
Well, I think if that was the assumption, I think that assumption is upended, because it's quite clear the data shows something else is going on here, and not just in the multilateral scene, but also in the private sphere as well. So for all multilateral organisations, including EBRD, we have to engage with this. To not engage with this is a bit like, was it Canute on the beach, telling the sea to go away? I think that's not going to happen. So, we really need to engage with this change environment.
That's very interesting. It strikes me that, we have the Bretton Woods organisations. The EBRD is, of course, a Western originated, if you like, organisation. But you seem to have managed, haven't you, to roll with the punches and to position yourself sort of above and beyond the diplomatic fray, because you do have this private sector inclination. There is a lot of respect for your technical abilities. You're not just extensions of foreign policy. Do you think the likes of the World Bank and the IMF have got something to learn from the way that you've managed to do this pull off this political stunt, if you like?
So I think all multilaterals need to learn from each other and actually do more things together as well. We, I think you're right, have been relatively depoliticized compared with many others. That may be because of the private sector niche that we've always had. The key going forward, though, is for us also to learn from them, from other multilaterals, about policy development, for example, and work together with them in helping to set policy in many countries too. So there's a bit of a mix and match here, it seems to me, too. But we always have been a global institution in terms of membership. You know, the United States is our biggest shareholder, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Mexico, Egypt, Morocco, these are all founding members. And what I find more and more as I go across our regions, and not just in Central Asia or not just in North Africa, but in our traditional region, such as Central and Eastern Europe, an interest in development models from around the world. There is no one development model that I think is supreme over any other. You go to Kazakhstan, you go to Tajikistan, very interesting, they look at the East Asian development models of Korea, of Japan, of Singapore, of Taiwan, the sort of more guided free market model, if you like. And they look at those, and that's where they want to send their civil servants, that's where they want to send their private sector people quite often for training. Tatarstan has a big program of civil service training with the Singaporeans for a reason, because they think that's a culture that's more like theirs than perhaps Britain would be.
So when I travelled to Berlin and helped smash down the wall, it wasn't the end of history then?
Well, it was the start of a new history. There is never the end of history. There is no turning point in history, I think I was taught in school. There are just sort of major events on the way. So I think the world is changing. I talk to youngsters from Poland, from Czech Republic, from countries that have been very successful in Eastern Europe. They also are looking at a variety of development models. Now, of course, for them, the European Union integration, the European Union development model is a very important part of what makes them tick, undoubtedly. Those are the major markets for those economies, but they also look to other places too.
What do you say to senior policymakers, senior elected leaders in the emerging East European economies, some of whom have even become members of the EU, of course, when they say to you, Dr. Chakrabarti, you're a very clever man, should we join the euro?
Well, they very rarely ask me such a question, because I then adopt immediately the British civil servant tactic that I don't have an opinion on.
That you're adopting now.
Exactly, exactly so.
It is a quandary, though, isn't it?
It is a quandary, and I think for each country, like in the UK, obviously when I was working in the UK Civil Service, people have to look at the pros and cons for them in terms of their national economic interests in the long term. Does it make sense? Does it not? My one piece of advice is to take it as an economic issue, not just a political issue. Exactly. I think that's the important thing.
And while we're talking about the shape of the multilaterals, how did you feel as you watched this debate, discussion, spat, if you like, over AIIB? Again, something that was very much beyond the mainstream, and then suddenly it burst into the business press as an issue. Do you think this will pass? Do you think it will just become another multilateral, or do you think it is really a game changer, given that it is now so explicitly Chinese-led?
Well, I think it's not so much that it's just Chinese-led. I think there's two parts to this. One is that, as I said in my speech in October at the Peterson Institute in Washington, the reason these institutions grew up, the reason EBRD grew up, after all, is because in some sense there's a shared view that the existing institutions aren't doing something as fast or in an innovative way as the developing countries, emerging markets would like. And now some of those emerging markets like China have clout, political and financial clout. The other part of it, though, also is that there are different models here of development at play as well. I think the best thing with the Asian Infrastructure Bank particularly is to engage, and not just ourselves, but the World Bank, Asian Development Bank and EBRD, we're all actually trying to get in on the ground floor to help the AIIB staff, the embryonic staff, shape the institution. So there have been workshops where we've been advising, for example, on environmental and social standards, along with the World Bank. We talk about governance, how to run governance, what sort of treasury function might they want. All of these things are really helpful to do and to share expertise with each other. The top thing for me, though, in a couple of years' time, as the IIB gets running would be to see if we can actually co-finance projects together in Central Asia, for example, where there's a huge interest in this new institution, and where, if we can co-finance projects together, that means our standards are aligned. So this whole debate about standards and difference of standards will have gone away, because actually we'll have adopted the same approach.
And of course our own UK Treasury has really led the charge among the G7 countries when it comes to a more conciliatory tone, haven't we, towards AIIB? Were you, I must admit, I was quite proud when the Treasury did that. Did you think it was a good sort of pragmatic decision?
I think in the sense of trying to embrace rather than repel, it's as the best way to change behaviour or feared behaviour. I think it's obviously the right approach, is to try and engage as much as possible. That's what we're trying to do, that's what the World Bank is doing. So I'm not surprised certain key shareholders like the UK, France, Germany, Italy, are all doing the same. South Korea now as well, all going in the same direction to try and embrace rather than reject.
What do you want to get out of this summit? What do you want delegates at this summit to grasp while they're here or there in Tbilisi in these few days that we've got together? What do you think we can achieve here together?
So I think with EBRD, it's always difficult to come up with one message, because such a range of countries. From Casablanca to Vladivostok is the EBRD set of countries now we deal with. So, but I would say there is one central message, that in a world where countries are competing, companies are competing for scarce investment resources, those who reform fastest, get their investment climates right, get their governance right, are likely to win that race. So for our countries, it's our job in EBRD to try and help them on that, in that race, really to have the right framework, really, so we can actually then help investors come to those countries and invest there, rather than in other countries. So that's the race I want EBRD to help our countries win.
So tell us a little bit more about the flows of capital that are coming from Asia in general into our EBRD region.
So what we've been mapping in EBRD is the sort of flows of capital from Singapore, from Korea, from Japan, from India, from the Gulf into our countries of operation. We already know the flows from North America and Western Europe very well, but we don't know about these flows from these other countries at all, really, or they're largely unknown, I would say. And when we looked at when we did this mapping, we thought in terms of economic weight of these countries, such as India, such as Korea, in the global economy, they were underweight in terms of the amount of investment they were doing in our region. So we asked ourselves, why is that? And it turns out quite often because they don't know our countries very well, they don't know the opportunities, and the costs of finding out, the transaction costs of finding out, the need for political comfort to invest in a country you don't know much about is very high. So, as a multilateral, it's our duty, again, to try and help companies that would be interested but don't know enough about the market we're talking about to come in. So we start, of course, with the markets they would know something about. So it's great to have Indian investors, for example, or Singaporean investors or Korean investors with us in Russia, in Georgia, in Turkey, and in Egypt. Those are countries they sort of know something about.
And often there are historic ties.
There are historic ties, and between Russia and India, for example, very much so. But the key and the great success would be to get beyond that, to get into the Jordan, to Tajikistan, to Kazakhstan and others, places they don't know quite so much about. And that is the next step. So if you look at what EBRD has done with some of these, with Korea, for example, it's 1.3 billion euros of investment in 24 years in our countries of operation. Now, I went to Seoul and I said, I don't think that's enough, really. No. I mean, given the size of economy you are, it might have looked good in 1991. It doesn't look good now in 2015. India, it's about 800 million euros. Again, way underweight for the size of economy India is, and with the Modi government pushing foreign investment or pushing investors to go abroad. So we therefore decided to do much more marketing in these countries as part of our medium-term directions.
And that's what's been happening over the last year.
That's what's been happening. So not just me, but my colleagues have been doing workshops in Seoul, in Mumbai, in Singapore, just to really increase. We've now opened a representative office in Tokyo. We didn't have one before, again, because it's much easier if you have some people there to engage with Japanese companies.
Have you got any other representative offices?
We've got one in Washington now as well. There are two new ones, and Brussels was the other one.
I guess the next step is to have one in Delhi, or
We don't know. I think we need to see where the fruits of this is going. I think our shareholders decide.
Are you feeling any traction though from?
I think there's interest. I mean, there's clearly interest. I think the key is that it's quite easy with some of the Korean and Indian companies and Japanese companies to go at the top level, if you like, the very big companies. So I talked about Tata in Georgia or Shrey in a large Indian leasing company in Russia. There are, of course, the big Japanese and Korean business houses already operating in our region. I would really like to do what we're trying to do in Germany, where we've been successful with the Mittelstand, to try and get into the Mittelstand in those countries too, and say, because they're the ones who really need the political comfort much more to come into a new country.
And is it just a question of persevering, or how are you really going to achieve that breakthrough? Don't we need a bit of a culture shift?
We're getting
from
a culture,
outside the EBRD, not just your own efforts.
I think the biggest culture shift that matters is the one that's happening, which is about the countries of operation themselves looking to these new markets. This isn't going to be determined by us or the shareholders alone. It's actually the countries of operation, their leaders, saying we want to team up with investors from these countries, these large emerging markets. I'm very proud. The other day we had our first big investment with a Mexican investor, and this is extraordinary because Mexico has been a member of EBRD for 24 years, but it's taken 24 years to get one Mexican investor into our region through EBRD. Now that's not good, but it's great that it started, and now we need to follow up and do more business with Mexican investors to try and get them in.
If you don't mind, let's just talk a little bit about, a bit more specifically about Ukraine. That's my miss. Of course, S&P have now said it's almost inevitable there'll be a default. That doesn't mean there'll almost inevitably a default, because there could be a bailout. What will the shape of this bailout be in broad? I know it's very market sensitive, but in broad brush terms, do you think it will be a combination of private sector and multilateral money? Do you think it will be a combination of Western, if you like, and Eastern money? I mean, it's a big hole. It's $25-30 billion gap we need to bridge here.
I think it's not so much the multilateral money. I think it's more the private creditors that particularly need to be focused on. And I know the Finance Minister, Natalie Oreshko, has been very much focused on that. She did a brilliant presentation here to our board. She'd been meeting bondholders in London. And she came in and spent an hour and a half here with us, talking to our board really about the case for restructuring of debt, but also generally for why EBRD and others should be investing in Ukraine, because reform is coming now with this government. The IMF program is there. That gives a macro framework that wasn't there in the past. I think also in the banking sector and the energy sector, the two sectors that were really way behind the times in terms of reform, that is now on the cards. So we're able to hopefully invest more. The reason we did some of the investments last year was because of some early signs of reform, particularly in the energy sector. Banking sector needs huge consolidation in Ukraine. I think there were 170 banks at the beginning of last year, which is an economy much smaller than Turkey, and Turkey has 40 banks. This was crazy, to have that number of banks. So the huge restructuring, consolidation, recapitalization of the banking sector is necessary as well. But I think that would give, in my view, the private sector bondholders and others some confidence in terms of restructuring.
We have to be careful, though, don't we, about over-egging the GDP projections. A big chunk of the economy lies physically in ruins. Donbass is crucial to the Ukrainian economy.
And that's right. The manufacturing sector, particularly the old-style manufacturing, is in that region, undoubtedly. But Ukraine's, in my view, its greatest comparative advantage compared with the rest of our countries of operation in that region is its agricultural potential. People have always talked about the potential breadbasket. It certainly was of the Soviet Union, and it can be for much more of our region. Interestingly, Ukraine exports so much grain to Egypt. Egypt imports most of its grain from Ukraine. So I think Ukraine has great opportunities as well. On the energy side, it is striking that it imports all this gas, but our calculations show that if in the next few years, maybe a decade and a half, it could reach Western European standards of energy efficiency, it would import very little gas. That's how far behind Ukraine is on energy efficiency. And that's why we need to invest massively in energy efficiency at the residential and district levels as well, in the private sector, of course.
And how important a fillip to the region would it be if we could have a sort of permanent ceasefire and a proper reconciliation between Ukraine and its rather large eastern neighbour.
Well, it would be a massive, blow for sense, good sense, and moving forward, I think Ukraine needs that to attract investors in the longer term, a sense of stability, a sense of being able to live at peace with both the East and the West, and decide its own destiny. And I think that would give investors a lot more confidence, of course, alongside all the reforms that are taking place.
And maybe the EBRD has a role to play. I know from my own conversations, you do have good offices in Moscow. You are a respected organisation, and yet you're clearly an organisation that is of the West and has the ear of the big Western countries too. So,
well, we can certainly play a role in terms of the economic issues. We can discuss those issues with both Russia, Ukraine, and the West, and we do that actually. The banking sector being a very good example of that. But in terms of the politics, in terms of the geopolitics, I think that's probably beyond EBRD's pay grade, actually. I think that's very much something they have to sort out themselves and they have to be committed to sorting that out. And we in the West can help them, but both sides have to be really committed to that solution. So, well, look, banking sector reform in Ukraine is fundamental. Banking sector in any country has to work effectively, efficiently to allocate money in a sensible way to priorities. And the banking sector in Ukraine does not do that. Fundamentally, it struggles to do that. Too many banks, too many bad banks, too many banks with oligarchs running them and involved in them. And this creates, if you like, a misallocation of resources throughout Ukraine. So unless the banking sector is sorted out in some way, unless good foreign banks as well as domestic banks survive and can create an environment in which they can flourish, it's very difficult to revive the economy in the long term. So it is a priority that we have banking sector reform in Ukraine in order to be able to do that. And we've done that successfully in some other countries. Ukraine is a very, very big challenge because of the size of the banking sector, of course, and the infiltration of the banking sector by oligarchs. So it requires not just good technical skills in the government and EBRD and others to design the project, it requires enormous political courage because you have to take on people who are very, very powerful with their own private militias and so on. And the good sign is, I would say, is the Ukrainian government has started to show that it will do that with the actions, for example, against Mr. Kolomoisky at the regional level. I mean, that is a very good sign. But it's the first sign of some very difficult actions. So political courage can't be underestimated in this transformation of Ukraine in the banking sector as one solid example of what needs to shift in Ukraine.
I mean, Russia still has a very long way to go. A couple of thousand banks still.
Yes.
Even longer tail of unconsolidated banks. Russia's just got the main utility function, of course, is carried out reasonably efficiently.
Yes.
Since Gref took over by Sberbank, it's still a monolithic and not particularly dynamic. And if you include VTB, it's still very state-dominated. But Russia's certainly got to grasp this nettle of bank reform. I would say
it has, and I think I'm a great fan of Herman Gref. It's quite interesting. The first time I met him in this job, I had met him many years ago when he was a minister. But in this job, my first visit to Moscow, I think it was in July 2012, towards the end of July. And the first thing he wanted to talk to me about was not about banking, was not about economics, it was about organisational change.
Oh, interesting, yeah.
Because he wanted to compare notes really on and the difficulties of trying to shift an organisation like Sberbank, huge, leviathan of an organisation, towards a more modern bank with modern sort of HR practices and modern ways of looking at customers and so on. It was a really refreshing conversation.
It really has started.
And he started it, and I think more power to his elbow, I'd say.
The customer experience, certainly in Moscow and St. Petersburg, is far better than it was.
Yeah.
It was, but what it's like in Perm or Omsk.
Yes, I don't know. I haven't tried their ATM machines, I must.
It's been really good to see you. And I look forward to seeing you in Tbilisi.
Look forward to it.
And we thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Liam.
All the best.
Thank you.